and help us think a little bit more deeply about how we're working, with our respective shelter and settlement roles. So it gives me great pleasure to begin the session and to act as facilitator for this session. My name is Brett Moore. I'm the co-lead for the Global Shelter Cluster with UNHCR. So on behalf of the Global Shelter Cluster and my co-lead Ella, I'm welcoming everybody. We'll just start with a bit of explanation of how the session will run. The session today will be interactive. We've got 3 specialists speaking for 10 minutes each, and then we're going to go into a breakout. We'll begin first with a Menti survey to get a sense of who's online and their particular roles and responsibilities. In the breakout sessions, we'll pose 3 particular questions which will be related to each of the presentations of the panelists. So those particular breakout sessions will run for around 10 minutes each, and they'll be facilitated. So thanks to our facilitators for the individual breakout sessions. Then we'll come back together, have a little bit more discussion and see what kind of conclusions we can draw on this issue. So just to begin, I'll give a little overview of the specific issues we're looking at in this session today. So the Nexus is something that many of us have been looking at, certainly in the cluster and the whole humanitarian coordination system. It's been a hot topic for some time. Many of the partners we have in the cluster are partners that operate across the whole spectrum of humanitarian response. They work within humanitarian shelter and settlement, but then right through recovery into permanent shelter provision in many contexts, both natural disaster and conflict related. The urban context presents some particular challenges. So we'll be looking at the role of development actors and how better partnerships can be formed, and what are the particular front lines of these 2 areas within the urban context. We'll look at the specific challenges in the urban context and what potential for better engagement for both humanitarian and development actors we can host, support and encourage within urban contexts, and especially new forms of partnership, in particular with municipal authorities and other non-humanitarians. Really, the main message that we'll get out of this is that it's critical for humanitarian actors to be able to identify and be able to adapt to the evolving factors that are driving urban humanitarian crises and response, be able to better understand and connect with non-humanitarian stakeholders in ways that we have not done in the past. So Angel, if we can go to the next slide, and I'll formally introduce our panelists.
Sorry, did you mean to be sharing the slides? They seem to have disappeared.
Thank you, Angel. There we go. That's great. Thanks everyone for bearing with us. Teams has been a little bit fragile with us today, so we'll just get back on track. Thanks, Angel. So the 3 distinguished panelists we have today, and we're really pleased to have them sharing their perspective from the different specialisations they work within. Firstly, we'll have Ellen Hamilton to speak, and Ellen's the lead urban specialist for Middle East and North Africa unit, looking at social, urban, rural resilience as part of the global practice within the World Bank. So welcome, Ellen. The second speaker we have is Dyfed Aubrey, who's the interregional advisor with UNHABITAT. So Dyfed speaking really from this specialisation in urban areas and with a particular focus in his career and work on urban development and shared prosperity in cities. Thirdly, we'll have Marc De Silva, who's the Asia Regional Coordinator with CRS. Marc's been with CRS since 1999, has worked on a variety of urban responses as country representatives. So each of our 3 panelists have a particular perspective on these issues, from a development perspective, an urban perspective, and a perspective from a global shelter cluster partner and humanitarian and development responder. So without further ado, I'll now introduce the Menti sessions. So just to kind of get us warmed up and kickstart, Angel, if you'd like to explain how this part of the session will work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. So just we will take a very quick survey to understand who is participating in today's session. The three questions that we will ask is, who do you work for? Whether you work for local authorities, governments, the UN, the World Bank, NGOs, or others. What is your main field of work, whether it is humanitarian or development? And what kind of setting are you working in, whether it's natural disaster or conflict or both? In order to access the Menti, I have shared the link for an online version on the chat. You can also access it through your mobile phone, either scanning the QR code on the presentation slide as you can see it, or going to www.menti.com and use the code that it's shown on the screen. So now I will just move to presenting the slides of the Menti so you can start answering these questions. We will take only a couple of minutes to do this. So I see that you already starting to answer some of the questions. So who do you work for? It's mostly NGOs, 5 from the UN, a couple from governments, 1 from the World Bank, and 6 from others. Good. So let's move to the, I think, Ellen, you are left alone in this presentation from the World Bank. Good, good. And it would be interesting to know later who the others are if you are not from a local authority, UN, NGO, or World Bank. So the next question is, what is your main field of work, whether it's humanitarian, development, or both? Okay, this is quite interesting to see that around 40% are working in both development and humanitarian, which is great for the subject matter of today's discussion. So that's good to know. So I think we can move to the last question, which is, what kind of setting are you working in, whether it's natural disaster, conflict, or both? Okay, so clearly both takes the majority. I guess there might be lots of people working from a global setting or donor perspective. Excellent. Okay, so I guess, with this, we can go back to the presentation and to the panelist discussion. Brett, I can hand you over.
Thanks, Angel. I think that was a really interesting little exercise to get us warmed up. And what it really indicates is that we've got some fairly equal representation from participants today, from different professions, different thematic focus, humanitarian, development, and also a reasonably even split on where people are primarily focused, whether it be conflict-related work or natural disasters. That's very positive. As the session goes on, of course, this is very good because the 3 breakout rooms we have will look at those issues. So we'll have good representation on each of those with a random selection of people going into each of the 3 groups. So without further ado, I will now invite Ellen, if you can please turn on your camera, and I'll begin with a couple of opening points for Ellen to respond to. So Ellen, in your role with the World Bank, I mean, you and I have had plenty of points of discussion in the past, most recently around the response in Lebanon, and you've had many years of experience really working on a range of issues: urban disaster risk management, conflict and natural disaster related response in urban areas. So Ellen, I know we have a short presentation for you, but just to frame this, what approaches do development actors such as the World Bank have for urban contexts? And really in relation to this current situation that we're facing around these combined effects of climate and conflict, displacement into urban areas, and with the backdrop of this rapidly expanding urban population around the world. So over to you, Ellen. Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be the sole representative of the World Bank here, because in fact, I know that around this virtual screen we have many of the people that we work with in different contexts, and I'm expecting and hoping to learn a lot from the conversation, as I usually do. So thank you, and thank you, Brett, and colleagues, for convening this event. Maybe actually to answer your question, that was actually, I did a very small little presentation, just a few visuals to kind of give some idea as to how we're thinking about it. Is it possible for somebody to put that up? That's not the first slide, but that's like slide 3. But I can, I mean, if it's a problem, I can, anyhow. So this is when we're talking about, I think there are 2 questions here, which is we more and more talk about urban, and why is that? And then how does the World Bank think about this? What we have on the screen is actually our emerging thinking, but let me just say 2 words or a few words. I think probably everybody around this screen, this virtual screen, already is aware of this, but basically as the world has urbanized, we've seen urbanization of natural disasters, urbanization of conflict, and urbanization of displacement and refugees. So, and this urbanization of all of these, of whether disasters, urbanization of people to begin with, but urbanization of disasters and urbanization of conflict, and the response that affected people from conflict, where they go, is requiring all of us to think collectively about how to do things differently, exactly because we no longer have sort of the from 20 or 30 years ago, the traditional, oh, the affected people are over here in this camp, and this camp is run by one of the big humanitarian agencies. So we've been doing some thinking about this, and have come to this idea of you need to think about the people and the place. So, and we see different groups tend to focus on one or the other. In my own world, in the World Bank, we often do these damage and needs assessments, which are very much the place, what happened to the place. Or the place could also be a place that is suffering from not being able to pick up the garbage because there's a lot more people who come in. But to look at it sort of through this place lens, or we also, there are parts of the World Bank, and I think parts of the humanitarian agencies as well, which are really focused on the people. Maybe we could move to the next slide. And so so you can think about these kind of people-based approaches, and this is subsidies to displace people to make sure they can eat and that they have a place to live and their kids go to school and that kind of thing. So we have the people-based, we have the place-based. And I think what's emerging for us from the perspective of people who work on urban areas that are dealing with the effects of conflict and or disasters is not that one or the other is right, but that we need to look at both. We need to look at a people in place. And so that means that if we are doing a damage and needs assessment, it's not enough to say which buildings were destroyed, but what happened to the people who were in those buildings? Where did they go? And what are their needs? So not to forget the people. So the infrastructure, the buildings, et cetera, is important, but without the people, it's you're only telling a very small piece of the puzzle. We can go to the next slide because I know I have not too long for this. So and this is coming out of a recent study actually that we just completed. I think it was completed in May. And it's called Cities, Migration, and Forced Displacement, an agenda for cities and towns. I'm sorry, that was the first slide that didn't get shown. But please feel free, if you're interested in this, feel free to look it up. It's okay, it's okay, it's fine. We can circulate this also afterwards. So if we can go to the next slide. And so here, so what does that mean to think about geographic spaces? So where, cities of different kinds, cities and towns, which is where maybe damage has happened, but it's also where people are in different variations of that. And to do something about that. And we will, I am more than happy to share this, but basically, I think we need to think of different dimensions. I don't want to go through this all in great detail. The ones in red are the place dimensions, and the ones in blue are the people dimensions. But spatial, what's happening with infrastructure and services and land, what's happening with social and the security dimensions, what's happening with the economic dimensions, what's happening with institutional dimensions. So sort of this would be the thematic, if you will, way that we would approach integrating a response for people in particular places. We can go to the next slide now. And when we think about the cities and towns, there are also different, we think of them a bit as typologies. Obviously, this is not intended to be a very hard and fast, but to give some idea. So on the far left, you have type 5, which is reconstruction. So this is, a city that has been destroyed by natural disaster like Port-au-Prince or conflict like maybe Aleppo. And that often these cities have experienced movements of population outside of the city. So do you just start rebuilding buildings? Who will return, right? Not everybody, by the way. But some people may. So one is places that have been heavily affected and have lost population as a result, and hope to have population come back. We also have a lot of as urbanization has increased, even where you have camps, they are often on the outskirts of cities, and we see this in Africa a lot, these urbanizing camps that sort of meld into the city itself. They grow up originally on the periphery, and how do you incorporate them? You have this more separate even types of camps still. There's some also mainly in Africa, by the way. There's a few in the Middle East, but not so many. And then I'd like to draw your attention to this inside the city, right? I think the camps, I think everybody has sort of a lot of experience with camps, et cetera. But the big change with urbanization has been this inside the city. And, and here I think you can think about it from the perspective of the city. So cities that are basically overwhelmed by coping with and this is not direct damage, right? This is the people who have come to their city or their town as a result of either disaster or conflict, right? So that are overwhelmed, or the ones that they're maybe not overwhelmed, but they have a lot of growing needs as a result of these people, but they have the sort of the capacity, institutional, human, partially financial, that may be their big challenge, to help integrate and respond to the needs of these people. Often what we see in Jordan, for example, this is the difference between like Amman, which has had a huge number of people come in, but Syrian refugees primarily, but has not been overwhelmed. I mean, they're overwhelmed in some ways, but not overwhelmed in terms of capacity. They know what they need to do. They just need some, financial support primarily in order to integrate and to provide more services. But some of the cities more in the north of Jordan that have received Syrian refugees have been overwhelmed as their populations have literally doubled overnight, with inadequate, for example, water resources even to tap into. So last slide. Move to the next slide, please. So here, I think we're here to talk about this nexus between humanitarian and development. I was giving you a bit of a perspective from the development side. If you look along this chart on the bottom, this is sort of a schematic idea, but from relief to development goes along the bottom horizontal axis, and fragility to stability along the vertical axis. And to give you some idea of this is actually from a year or two ago in the Middle East, but Syria in conflict, you are talking at most emergency response. Iraq also is extremely fragile, still ongoing fighting, etc. Lebanon, maybe is further towards the development side, although, as we've seen, not entirely, so not as far along as some places might be. And then you get to countries like Jordan, where you do have a pretty stable government, even though they've had this huge influx of refugees. So it's not a strict break, it's a continuum. And I think the helpful thing is for the two different, if you will, main parties not to think just within relief and just within development, but to be thinking across the spectrum so that we can better tailor our responses and coordinate. That's my main message, is coordinate our responses to be mutually reinforcing. So with that, let me say thanks and hand it back over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Helen. That was great, very clear. I won't ask you any more questions just at the moment, but what we'll do is probably circle back at the end of the session, because we'll go to the other two speakers and then the breakout group. And I think we'll pick up on some of the other questions near the end, because they can kind of wrap up some of the points you've made. So thanks very much, Ellen, and especially for looking at some of the issues in conflict contexts, because notoriously conflict contexts are where most of the clusters are active, and also where finding solutions and finding ways of working in this complicated crossover between the political, the social, the physical destruction is very hard to find. So thanks very much for mapping that out. Dyfed, I'll turn to you now, and if you can put on your camera, please, Dyfed, and I'll just kind of pose a few questions and thoughts to you, and feel free to take these in any way you want and expand on some of these ideas according to your particular vantage point and the role that you have with UNHABITAT, and also, of course, your past experience. When we're thinking of the history that the humanitarians have had in working in urban areas, and maybe one of these big crisis points was Haiti, as Alan mentioned. And since then, we've had the World Humanitarian Summit. There's some really key events, such as the World Urban Forum events hosted by UNHABITAT every couple of years. We see progress along the last decade, especially, where humanitarians have started working differently in urban areas. But what might be some concerns of yours around where there's been no progress? And what do you think humanitarians have failed to achieve? What should they be concentrating on, if you have some thoughts on that? Thanks.
Okay, so thanks very much, Brett, and thanks for inviting me to this to speak at this session. I think what we find is that, as Ellen was mentioning, that crisis is getting more protracted, crisis is becoming more urban, and so the way we need to respond is about building self-reliance from early stages, as with relevant social safety nets, etc., but also leveraging the possibilities of cities to be responders to crisis. And we see that crisis, displacement, etc., is a force for urbanization. It's a driving force for urbanization. And so if we, from an urban lens, to manage this sustainably, it requires us to understand how cities can be managed in a sustainable way. And if we go back to the new urban agenda, we look that cities require policies, it requires planning, It requires financing frameworks. It requires, accountable, inclusive governance. So if we're taking these sort of elements forward and looking at how humanitarian actors and development actors responding to crisis are working along these sort of pillars of sustainable urbanization in order to have a sustainable urban response, I think on a policy side, I think we don't really have enough really well evaluated urban programs and good data to be able to really support policy discussions. So I think there's work to be done there, so that when we're engaged in policy discussions, and should we have a refugee camp, or should we integrate them into cities, or should we expand an extension of the city, that we have really good evidence to support arguments that can be conducive for policy development. I think planning, I think we're doing quite, things have progressed a long way since the World Humanitarian Summit and since Haiti in particular on planning. We're seeing, as Ellen mentioned, that some cities are open to integrating displaced persons into the urban fabric, into host communities. Burkina Faso being an example right now, where the cities are making an effort to integrate, but need some support in building the infrastructure needed to accommodate that greater population. We're also seeing that cities like in Ethiopia in 2017, following that sort of move of people from Somali region to Oromia region, that cities were looking at how to integrate populations within planned extensions of cities. So rather than building camps, there were little pockets of the city that were designed with proper street widths and public spaces and these kind of things, conducive for sort of longer term protracted displacement. And we're seeing that in Iraq and in Somalia now, in Burkina Faso, as well as in Ethiopia. So the idea of planning, instead of having a camp, having a planned city extension, because at the end of the day, if we, in a protracted setting, when you're working with sphere standards and 6 meter wide roads or whatever it might be, when people eventually replace their tents with buildings, if they're not planned to urban guidelines, you've created a slum. And so this understanding, I think, is becoming well captured and implemented. And I think there's a value proposition to cities that, the humanitarian investment that comes in, instead of simply going to a camp that's there and then eventually goes or maybe never goes, you're actually investing in the city itself. So you include people in the city, we'll help you build, extend, improve your hospitals, your schools, and real infrastructure for the extension of your city or whatever it might be. So I think that planning dimension is starting to really take some traction. But then that really needs to then go into the next piece, which is finance. And I think that's what's one of the challenges that we're facing now then, because if we're looking at these sort of urban scenarios, it requires upfront investment. And I think that upfront investment is often not there. We've gone from annual financing to multi-annual financing. That's moving in the right direction, but there needs to be an upfront finance. And when we're looking at camp expansions in Iraq, we are finding that, compared to a tented camp, like an urban camp, takes you to like a 4-year period to get to a break even. So what you spend on a camp over 4 years is what you need to invest straight away. But then over the long term, you don't need camp management, you don't need to replace infrastructure, tents, etc. It's like actually a cost saving. So bringing donor financing for upfront investment is a challenge for us. And then, but by extension, if we're working in urban areas, whether it's within existing communities or extensions of communities, we then need to be looking at working with the service providers. Who's responsible for settlement infrastructure, and what does that, and how do we work with those actors that are responsible for settlement infrastructure? So how do we work with the water authorities? How do we work with the institutions that build roads and these kind of things? And so I think that's a challenge for the humanitarian sector in responding to urban crisis. Financing modalities and working with a lot of these service providers. In terms of challenges and moving forward, I think we also see as more and more people are coming to cities and we're having more and more of these urban crises, we need to understand cities better. And I think progress has been made in profiling cities. I think that now we have habitats involved, GIPs, other people are involved with city profiling, so we really understand the impacts of crisis on cities and who the service providers are and whether it's good to have a integrated approach on extension of city, etc. We're seeing more flexibility in terms of area-based responses, building on the way that communities. But in terms of moving forward, I think, as mentioned, we need to move from sort of good that we get in multi-year funding, but we need upfront capital. We need to see how that can work. And then that needs to sort of also give way then into development finance and eventually better own source revenue so cities are more resilient either through fiscal transfers or building their revenue capacity. So there needs to be sort of a continuum, a nexus from initial humanitarian finance to development finance and own source financing. We also, I think the humanitarian community needs to go from being experts in service provision to also being experts in working with service providers. We've seen how UNICEF they can do emergency wash support, but they're also working with water utility companies and the rest of it. And I think why not, in the humanitarian, the shelter settlement that we have CCM, camp management people working, knowing how to work with urban planners or being urban planners. So I think we need to sort of go from being entities that can provide services to being entities that can also work with service providers. And then as we do that sort of ends up also hinting at how we can support service providers with development finance. Usually donors are a bit reluctant to, the due diligence needed to invest in many, many cities and many, many utility companies or service providers. That's quite complicated. But as we become experts in working alongside them and we still have relationships with donors, maybe there's a way of channeling investment into service provision and into cities that way. So there's a few food for thought. And just one other thing to add to that mix is the importance of secondary cities. I think some of the challenges, I was in Somalia recently, is that a lot of the displaced populations are coming to cities. And maybe we should be really channeling a lot of our efforts, as also was taking place in Oromia in Ethiopia, into some of the smaller cities, because if population movement can be distributed over many cities, many smaller cities instead of major cities, then the impacts can be better managed and the quality of life could potentially be improved of those populations that we're trying to serve. So I'll leave you there with the idea that, even though humanitarian actors working in humanitarian spheres, let's blur those distinctions between being humanitarian and being development actors.
Thanks very much, Dyfed. That's very comprehensive, and I know that our recent, connection with the high-level panel on urban displacement. I won't ask you the question now, but I want to return near the end of the session around forced displacement in urban areas and IDPs, and how long is an IDP an IDP before they become part of the, let's just say, the vast urban poor which we have in many cities around the world, and are their needs that different? So that's just to prod you with that question. We'll come back to that one later. But thank you very much. Much appreciated. Marc, I'll turn to you next. And, in your role with CRS, and as I mentioned in the introduction, with CRS, working across the whole range, the whole spectrum of displacement from humanitarian response right through, and even before response as well, through a lot of resilience building activities. And I know that you have been working in many urban contexts across your career. What do you think are the key challenges associated with shelter and settlement reconstruction and response in urban areas? I know in our exchange earlier today, you shared different experiences in different contexts. So maybe some of your thoughts on that and what successes you've found in your career, but also as CRS that might be food for thought for everybody online. Thanks, Marc.
Sure. Thank you, Brett. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those of you who are on this side of the world. I'm calling in from Cambodia. You know, for me, I thought I'd focus on really one big challenge, you know, when we talk about what faces us as humanitarian organizations. And it's that it's oftentimes hard for us to look beyond the bubble of the rubble. And when I sort of say that beyond the bubble of the rubble, you know, the rubble is what we often find in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, whether it's conflict or natural disaster. And as humanitarian workers, as aid workers, all of our organizations often have specialized staff who are the first on the ground, and the different coordination mechanisms come together, and that's really who we're talking to. I mean, we might have other stakeholder engagements, but oftentimes we're reinforcing what's important, what our priorities are. And you know, so I think it's important for us to recognize that emergency response staff are often driven primarily by the humanitarian imperative, and so that's how the focus on the design, the assessment, and the planning goes. And then oftentimes there's unfortunately so many of these disasters around the world that the team that's initially on the ground putting the strategies together then move on to the next humanitarian imperative in another country, and another group of colleagues come in and take over. As has been mentioned before, you know, there's different modes of financing in the early phases with early recovery and later on. And a lot of the funding that initially supports humanitarian organizations in the shelter and settlement context does come from emergency response donors and donors interested in early recovery. And so since those are what the priorities are for those grants, that's what the projects are structured for, that's what the outputs are. And so the time frame is really oftentimes limited to those 18-month, 24-month projects. And then when those projects come to an end and it's time to shift to those longer-term financing mechanisms, those mechanisms aren't often the same mechanisms that humanitarian actors are accessing or are familiar with. And so many of the humanitarian organizations will struggle to secure that funding to transition to a longer-term approach to shelter and settlement. And when those struggles take place and the funding comes to an end, then in many cases the presence of those organizations in country ends, or if they had been there before, it shifts back to another sector, which is considered more along the lines of a development sector. You know, during the course of the immediate relief and early recovery, it takes time to properly understand the historical and political context of housing, of urban planning. You know, the types of interviews and key informants you would have to meet with are not necessarily the same ones who are involved in the immediate response. And so organizations have to weigh, is this a good use of our staff time when there's always people working 16-hour days and you have those immediate deadlines of getting the immediate relief and early recovery outputs? And then as difficult as it is to understand those historical and political contexts when you're an international staff coming into those countries for the first time, it takes even more time to develop the trusting relationships needed with those key stakeholders that is going to catalyze the systems change that's often needed to facilitate and sustain urban reconstruction. So for me, those are the sort of the key elements I think of when I think of what the big challenge is. But I also want to focus that most of those 5 points are points that are within our control as humanitarian organizations to address. I think we sometimes take the easy way out and say, well, the donors are not funding this, so we can't do anything about it. Whereas there is something we can do. And it requires looking at how we approach disasters prior to when they occur and how we approach them the first day they occur as well. And so maybe just to share some of, you know, how we've tried to address some of these challenges at CRS. You know, I started off my career in Sierra Leone, and we did urban housing recovery when the rebels had come in back in the late 90s. I was also in India after when the tsunami occurred. But more recently, I've worked in Bosnia and Greece and here in Asia with Nepal in natural disaster and man-made disasters. And one thing which we've started doing is starting to plan simultaneously during the first days of immediate relief and recovery with a longer-term change in mind. We are one of those organizations which has programming on both the humanitarian and the development side. And so in many of these cases, we were in those countries ahead of time. We did have an understanding. We do have staff. And so to make certain we're staffing our emergencies, not just for the immediate phase, but for those colleagues who can go and begin to see how the immediate response is going to lay the foundation for a longer term sustainable response. And to try and support that more globally, our organization has launched a new initiative, which we're calling the Homes and Communities Initiative. It's a strategic change platform that really looks to go beyond implementing just our own projects, where we're looking to influence more systemic change across the countries where we're doing shelter and settlement programming, not just over a 2 to 3 year period, but over a 10-year period. And so what I've seen is making that 10-year commitment first internally within your team, so that it sends the message you need to be thinking about what these communities are going to look like in 2030, not just in 2021, 2022, when the 18-month early recovery program is finished. But how are we going to shift from that emergency phase to a longer term phase? And what's going to be our approach as humanitarian organizations of shifting also from our traditional role of filling those gaps that are unable to be filled in the immediate aftermath of an emergency, to the longer term role, which is not so much filling the gaps, but helping governments and markets to close the gaps and to close them at scale, which is a level that we're unable to do, not just as individual humanitarian organizations, but even if you bring together 10 or 20 humanitarian organizations, you're not going to get the same level of scale that you can get when you're working with government and markets to close those gaps. And so one of the things we're doing within CRS is really looking at the fact that we do have private funds. I mean, while grant funding makes up about 2/3, 3/4 of our organizational budget every year, about 1/3 of that is private funds with various levels of restriction or unrestriction. But the levels of restriction usually come in the immediate aftermath of an emergency. And so when we're raising funds from those private donors, we are trying to say this is not going to be used just in the first 2 to 3 years to do the immediate the delivery of services, but also to try and lay the foundation for helping governments to not just address the immediate needs met by those affected by the emergency, but also those other vulnerable groups who have been living in society, and especially in a lot of these urban areas for many years. And so how are we trying to invest those private funds? 3 main areas. One of them is really sustaining and investing in local core staff and empowering them to really look at this from a 10-year perspective. And my experience here and attitude has been influenced by my work in Bosnia for 6 years, where we had a head of program who was from the country, Stanela Imamovic. If any of you know her, actually, I'm going to give a shout out to her. She's been working on urban housing issues in Bosnia for 25 years. Even though some of us come and go for 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, she knows what the issues are. She knows what the politics are, and she was able to use that understanding to really develop relationships with key individuals at all levels of the government in Bosnia, from the municipal level to the national level, where to the point where the national ministers were relying on CRS and her in particular, I should say, to try and orient and mentor and accompany the municipal staff who were going to be implementing the national level programs. In Greece, when we first started up after the migrants and refugees were coming in 2015, it was one of our Greek staff who had connections with one of the vice mayors in Athens that opened up possibilities for how we could not just be looking at meeting the immediate needs of newly arriving refugees and migrants, but how we could help the municipality of Athens to look at applying those lessons to the longer term migrants, 300,000 to 400,000 of whom had been in Athens for the previous 10, 20 years. And so really making certain that regardless of how our grants come and go, we're using private funds to find, sustain, and empower those core local staff who will really be able to stay in that context for a long term. Second key area is generating evidence. And while a lot of us as organizations have generated evidence before, what I've seen often is that the funding for that evidence generation often is related to projects. And so whether we realize it or not, we're often writing that, generating that evidence for the donors who have actually funded the projects. Now, in some cases, the evidence that the donors are looking for is aligned well with what the key decision makers in government, in the host country government, are looking for as well. But in other cases, it's not as much. And so one of the mistakes we'd made in the past is we didn't go enough to those key government decision makers who are going to be looking at the longer term policies, not just in the urban areas, but across the country, but particularly in the urban areas as well. And really double checking with them, what is the evidence they're looking for and the evidence they need to try and work their system in terms of how they're going to be allocating their own budgets, for future urban policy and housing policy as well. And so making certain that as we generate evidence, we're looking at models that are realistic models and models that are costed to what the realities are of the local government. And then the third area that we're investing private funds in, and I referred to this a bit on the first point, but I think is almost the most important one, and it's in creating trusting relationships. How can we help government overcome their challenges to meet their own development goals and not just be approaching the governments when we need them to sign off on our emergency programs, our humanitarian programs. And so this issue of making certain that our problem analyses are not just looking at the immediate needs facing the families, which we're concerned with, but also the systemic needs that are facing the municipal leaders, facing the national leaders, so that we're understanding what their concerns are, and we can then decide how we're going to be able to help government look at addressing those issues over the longer term. So, Brett, I'm not certain if my time is coming up or if I have a minute or two left. Or
I think that we're just winding up now.
Okay.
I think Marc, if you've got just a final comment, but otherwise we'll go to the breakout room shortly.
Yeah. So just a final point on what the global shelter cluster could do. And I think if it's really to try and make certain that space is made in those early meetings after emergencies occur, that there is this longer term thinking. It might not always be the most pressing or priority issue, but I think the earlier that these discussions can be had amongst humanitarian actors in the first year or two after an emergency, the more it can make its way into various strategies that humanitarian organizations have for the longer term. Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. That was great, very comprehensive and much appreciated. You've spelt out really a whole series of actions and approaches across the full spectrum of response. So thank you very much, much appreciated. We'll come back to some of these issues in the last 10 minutes of the session. We'll break out into our groups now. On how, if there's any particular instructions, please feel free to step in and give them. You'll see the 3 questions there for each of the breakout rooms. And thanks also to the facilitators. So for the first breakout room, what is the role of development actors in urban areas and how can humanitarians better connect? And we've got Louise Taylor from Impact facilitating that room. So thank you very much, Louise. For the second question, we're looking at the question of how do humanitarian shelter actors better connect to and understand urban actors? And that's facilitated by Tulio from CRS. And then for the third room, we're looking at the question of what does the Nexus mean for GSC partners and what does it mean about us working differently and gathering some ideas and thoughts around that. So I can see from the participants we have online, we've got a lot of very, very experienced people. We've got experienced practitioners who I know have a lot to add to these discussions. So we'll now separate the participants into the 3 breakout rooms. And anything from your side on Hal about how to look at this from an administrative side? We'll have around 20 minutes for this segment.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment, there will be these 3 breakout rooms. There will be approximately 25 people per room. And if you can help out the facilitators to put yourself in order on when you want to provide comments and answer the questions, and they will take notes on a Jamboard that they will present later into plenary. So just basically just provide your comments and they will be taking notes on your on your inputs into the session. Okay, so maybe Renee, if we can go straight into the breakout rooms. Thank you very much.
They're trying to open.
Okay, Tulio, it seems that the room number 2 may not have opened up and we are all left in the plenary. So Perhaps you can go ahead here on the plenary with the group.
Yeah, I tried to, that room failed. So yes, group 2 will have to be here. So sorry about that. Because I tried to add another room and it also failed. So I'm not sure why that is. Apologies.
So please go ahead, Tulio.
No problem. Let me share the screen. Hello, everyone. So I hope that you enjoyed the conversation that we were having with the panelists. My name is Tulio Mateo, and I'm from CRS. And I think based on the conversation that we were having, or that the panelists were sharing their experience, we want to target to address this question. You know, how do we, as humanitarian shelter actors, better connect and understand urban actors? No, so. The plan is for you to raise your hand, for you to share some of your thoughts, and I will be inputting it here. And then we can have a back and forth, and then we will present it in plenary. So do we have a first volunteer to answer this question?
Hi, Tulio. This is Amelia from CARE.
Hi, Amelia.
So I'd save you the silence. So I'm wondering here. I think that perhaps the Beirut blast has offered some learning here, and I think some of the advantages, if we're going to say advantages, is that there are existing coordination mechanisms and there are existing shelter working groups in Lebanon, and so that really, and the stage in which the refugee response was at in Lebanon had already established some of those longer term connections with development actors. So when the renewed emergency came through, those connections were already there. So perhaps it is about putting an onus on developing those relationships in advance of sudden onset crises, so that we're not starting from scratch each time. In an ideal world, of course.
Okay, yeah, I'm putting that note.
Yeah.
Can you see it here?
I can, yes. Great.
Would that summarize the idea?
It does, yeah. It's not rocket science, but I just thought I'd get the conversation started.
No, but I think, you know, one of the things that Marc said was like somehow building that trust, and I think that's one of the factors. No, if you are there early and you can set up those coordination mechanisms, that you know, you can start connecting and building that trust. Aubrey, did you raise your hand? Dyfed?
I think it's also in advance, is making those connections in advance of a crisis, not just early on, as in terms of the response, but as a mitigation measure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, over from me.
Thanks, Amelia. Dyfed.
Yeah, so I think building on that point made by Amelia, I think is also really important to have some of the urban actors in those coordination mechanisms. Quite often we've got the NGOs there. We might have someone from local government, but you know, are we getting the local service providers in, and even some of the local private sector? So expanding that local coordination mechanism to include some of the key urban actors, including service providers. I think another thing to add also, which is starting to gain traction, is this idea of urban profiling. And that's basically a kind of a spatial mapping of the impacts of a crisis on a city, and trying to sort of unpack how that impacts on the functionality of services, and then linking that to and the functionality of the local economy, the housing market, etc. Really trying to understand the impacts of crisis on a city, and then trying to understand who owns what is the institutional owner of that challenge, and how we can support that institutional owner. So I think urban profiling is a very good way of the humanitarian community trying to understand how they can contribute to the urban system, and how the urban system then can deal with the crisis.
Can you say that again? The word you said, institutional mapping, or you said something?
Yeah, so I think what's become quite popular is called city profiling, and this is basically GIS-based spatial mapping of the impacts of the crisis on various aspects of the city. So partly on strains in service provision, impacts on the housing market, impact on the job market, etc., the functionality of services, and then to understand who are the institutional owners of that challenge, or the duty bearers, who are the institutional duty bearers, and then how can the humanitarian community get alongside those institutional duty bearers.
All right. I actually, when you were presenting, I noted that how we should become service providers or enable others. No, and I think that was a key thing that I noted from your slide, and that connects well with what Amelia was saying of building that trust and doing that analysis, but building that trust at the same time. I see that we have one more hand up. Mostafari Rene.
Yes, hi, this is Rehana from NRC.
Mm-hmm.
Do you hear me well? My internet,
yes.
I'm not sure. Okay, cool. No, I just wanted to also echo what the point was raised, and I think the shelter sector and cluster could play a role in that, because normally also in humanitarian and emergency or early recovery setting, we already have like those monthly meetings, and but like in some contexts that I work, like for example Iraq or now in Nigeria, I mean, we know that there are like development actors like UNHABITAT and UNDP that they're doing like shelter work, but we don't know much detail about it. And I think sector hopefully could facilitate, at least even though to be aware of what they are doing, to make sure if you're planning kind of more durable shelter solution, it's in some sort aligned, or at least as it was mentioned, to establish those connections at least.
So if I had to put that in a sentence, in a sticky note, how should I put that in?
I would say, I mean, for sector to engage the development actors at least once in a while. It could be quarterly or biannually, that even in the humanitarian and early recovery setting.
I'm trying to maybe. I don't know. I'm trying to put that idea there. Not sure. You can suggest, if you can put it on the chat, that would be great, and I can just copy it here. But as I was saying all of this, I'm thinking about there was another idea that was dropped in the session, that was the change of interest or willingness of those different actors, no, and the politics. So how do we connect and understand that those politics that might happen in the urban setting? And how do we connect with those? Anyone want to add? Very quiet group. But it's up if anyone who already spoke wants to add anything else. It's you are welcome.
Tulio, do you mind repeating the question? I lost you for a second.
The question is the same. We maintain around the same question on how do we humanitarian shelter actors connect and understand urban actors. No, and I was wondering how do we connect with the politics that happen in an urban context, and you know, if you have practices or things that you want to share, so we can put it here.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on this one. I think that's a really, really important question. And you know, while you know, a lot of the solutions we talk about are technical solutions, the big thing, the elephant in the room, is the political incentivization, and I think that's 90% of the challenge. I think there needs to be stronger understanding of good lessons learned. We need data. We need to be able to support arguments, because quite often on the urban solutions, we just have good ideas. We think this worked well in some places. We don't know yet. And I think one part of it is strengthening that sort of evidence base to support arguments. I think another thing then is the whole humanitarian development community having a unified approach, because if cities or stakeholders or national governments, whoever it might be that are making the decisions, are seeing the entire humanitarian community going in one direction, they might say, well, all the advice we're getting, whether it's from CRS, whether it's from a UNDP or HCR or anybody else, they're all telling us this, there must be something in it. So I think having a more sort of united approach to different things will also help make messages strong.
That's why we have the global the shelter clusters to harmonize, let's say. I also feel that maybe we need to start using the settlements word, because it also has a more of a urban connotation that has it will help also when we are dealing with the politicians, politics. Somebody else wants to add?
I was just going to say before, hi, it's Amelia.
Yeah.
Again. I think it's about also connecting at different scales. So in terms of field level interaction with local community representatives or community groups, women's groups, for example, and taking on a responsibility there that we are engaging with all, doing a stakeholder mapping, engaging with all active stakeholders in that neighborhood, and then scaling that up and making sure that at each scale we are taking on responsibility as a humanitarian sector to be engaged in those conversations that would go from cluster and coordination level right down to implementation. And I think working with local actors and localization will automatically improve that as well.
Okay, that connects quite well with what Dyfed was saying about the profiling, but also being very assertive of those levels. Now that we feel the ground level, but then let's say neighborhood,
municipality,
municipality,
up to local government. Yeah.
And then another concept that I think Dyfed mentioned, but maybe somebody else wants to add, is the fact of complementary settlements or secondary settlements or cities. How do we connect with those that might be indirectly influenced by the crisis? Anyone else? I think we have so many people and nobody wants to raise the hand. But Soida, yes.
Soida, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tulio. This is Soida from Habitat. I think linking it to the settlement-based approach, because again we have a multi-sectoral approach to that. So because again you have the different actors, but then being brought together by the settlement approach. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and
sorry, just before you go ahead, there's 2 minutes left, so I think there is time to take one more note.
Could I go ahead, or you want to?
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted, again, yeah, for the smaller cities, as it was mentioned, we are doing a lot of humanitarian organizations. We are doing integrated programming, multi-sectoral approach, which could really lead well into early recovery and development. But I also think we need to think in different scales. For example, you have a city like Lebanon that is very urban, and it's accepted that humanitarian and development, they work. But you have, like, other contexts that is still kind of emergency, could be like, for example, Nigeria, but we also know that they're development actors. So I think it cannot be one size fit all, and we have to have different levels of engagement between humanitarian and urban actors and also development actors.
Would we say that we need to have institutional and programmatic flexibility to adapt to that?
Exactly, and at what stage do we want to engage? After 6 months of a crisis, 1 year, or as soon as other like urban actors they come. So yeah, I think it would be different scenarios for different contexts.
And to capture your idea before we transition to the plenary.
Just one last point, if I may, Tulio.
Yes.
If we can channel funding through institutional actors, you will find that they're very eager to work with us. And I think the problem is we don't channel funding through these other urban actors. And so they don't see the point of coordinating with us. They don't see anything in it for them.
Okay. So we need to, but that's closely related to building trust, I think. But they need to see the win on the process, no?
Exactly. They need to see that they've benefited from being part of this. They're able to do something better because they joined in with this coordination structure. They were part of it. That they contributed to an impact, etc. And money talks.
Tulio, we are already back on plenary, so
okay.
You can finish your slide by yourself. I'm going to share the screen for Brett to take over.
All right.
Right, so I think everyone's back. Sorry, I think everyone's back in the main session now. So what we will do is just quickly get a round of feedback from each of the facilitators. Louise, if I can go over to you for group one, if you can give us just a quick snapshot over the key themes and discussion.
Sure. Do you need me to share my screen? No, you have it. You have it, right?
I'm sharing it. Just 1 second.
So lesson learned. 20 minutes is not enough. It takes a while to sort of break the ice and
Yeah, there has been quite a vivid discussion in my group, so very happy to have moderated this discussion. If I were to recap in a single sentence, I would say that there seems to be a tension between, on the one hand, addressing the specific emergency needs that communities affected by a crisis are facing, and we've been discussing the example of internally displaced people quite a lot. And on the other hand, the absolute necessity to sort of provide upfront investment and think of longer term solutions for the entire urban system. But it's only a tension when you start thinking about it, but actually it tells more about the fact that humanitarian and development interventions are absolutely complementary and mutually benefit each other. So, for instance, investments in urban services that are usually undertaken by development actors, so investment in urban infrastructure and sustainable waste management systems, etc., they may not be the best solution to meet the short-term needs of the community, but in the end, they will benefit all vulnerable groups that suffer either vulnerabilities caused by crises or more chronic vulnerabilities. So this is something that would require, I guess, a little bit of more dialogue between humanitarians and development actors to be able to think and plan the solutions ahead. Preparedness is absolutely key. There you can see like the third post-its talking about preparedness. And preparedness is also a lot about dialogue. And we had a few examples from Nepal who really highlighted and spoke about concrete tools to plan preparedness interventions, recovery interventions. And these are platforms that gather humanitarian stakeholders intervening in a place, in a city, together with local governments and together with development actors. And someone said that, for taking the example of Nepal, in the beginning there were, just after the earthquake, there were about 200 international emergency organizations. And then the number of organizations interested in taking that work further down the road to development has sort of shrunk in time. And there's less humanitarian organizations who seem to be prepared to invest in longer term thinking in collaboration with development actors. So this was sort of the last point, but we do maybe want to have a better understanding of how development actors operate. Although it was true, as Ellen said, that in the beginning development actors were more focused on place and infrastructure, she also made a point about the fact that this thinking is changing over time to consider communities as more central elements of their approach. And the same change can also be seen in the humanitarian sector. We do tend to pay more attention to existing services, infrastructure, and places than we used to in the past. And that does represent quite an unprecedented opportunity to collaborate in specific crisis-affected cities. So I'm going to stop here, and I would just like to welcome anyone who was in my group to jump in if I missed out on something absolutely critical for this wrap up. Feel free to interrupt and just add a few points. Thank you. Well, I think it's all right then. Over to you, Brett.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
We've got someone coming in. I can hear somebody.
Yeah, but yes, I don't know if you can hear me though, because I have problems in the breakout room.
Yes, Lilia, if you have any comments, please feel free to add.
Yeah, I would just like to share something really quickly that I was able to share earlier. I wanted to say that the shelter cluster and all cluster cluster coordination mechanisms are great spaces for linking up urban actors and humanitarian actors. If we as humanitarians can, welcome also development actors, and in our case in Honduras, we have the Territorial Planning Commission, we have the Housing Agency of Honduras, so that really helps like bridging bridge the gaps and jointly develop strategies together. That's all. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Lilia. That's an important comment, and I think it also shows the diversity of the coordination arrangements in different countries. We'll go on to the next group now, group number 2. Tulio, if you can give a couple of minutes to wrap up the observations and key comments from your group. Thank you.
Yes, and actually it connects with what Lilia was just saying. One of my notes here on the summary, it's that, as you will see, there's the need to have the city profile, and that includes understanding the existing platforms, the existing the politics that are behind. So that's very important for us to connect and liaise with urban actors. And just to complement, that's one of the steps in the settlement approach guidance note that we will share tomorrow in the working group sessions. Then we also have the understanding who are those urban actors, and that's part of the city profile, but also the government agencies who own specific challenges, and that was something Dyfed was referring. We need to really connect with those government or institutions that target specific challenges that we are going to work on. As you will see, there's also something on having on understanding the different scales of work from the core of the community to the whole neighborhood, and then to the municipality, and then the regional or national government. And we need to have the flexibility as humanitarian actors to connect at not only one, but probably at multiple levels, no? Because that will generate, that will show that we are intentional about the work, but also to have a better influence, no? And then maybe the most important, because of that connection, is to build trust, no? To build trust and make those actors that we are, the urban actors that we are connecting with, to make sure that they know that they are owning the process, no? That they are owning the response as we work with them. So we are not just benefiting from their work, but they can feel that they benefit from their own work, no? And I think there was also a final note that Dyfed gave on the group, and I think that summarizes our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Tulio, much appreciated. We'll go to a final set of comments at the very end, but we'll go to group 3 now. Richard, how did your group go, and what are your takeaways from the session?
I think we really got going towards the end. At the beginning, we looked a lot around that understanding. I think Tulio's just mentioned the knowledge about understanding, about localization, about self-resilience, and all these things that we've heard about earlier. And then I think towards the end, I think a couple of colleagues started to say, well, hold on. In order to get all this, we need better training. We need, and this is something that the Global Shelter partners can do. They can train their staff in a lot of this. So there's a lot of training required. But then I think certainly for me at the end, what really began to interest me was this idea: is there anything new here? Is this not what we should be doing anyway? Should we not be here already? Have we not been having a conversation about localization for a long time? Have we not been having a conversation about handing over, about building on coping mechanisms? and just because we've got the name now, which is the Nexus, that we are all having this conversation. So I think that was, we were just getting going, and I think that was a really interesting point, that a lot of what we say is best practice, and the global shelter clusters should do what we say we should do. And a lot of that is already done, and a lot of that is best practice. The fact that we don't, that's another discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. That's a good final point from your group. Thought-provoking, and very relevant, very welcome. Thank you for that. We've got a couple of minutes left now. It would have been great if we had a bit more time, but I know the session's actually gone quite quick. And when we start unpacking these issues, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. One thing that I'll do now, I'll just quickly summarize a couple of key points from the speakers, and then I'll invite Alan, Dyfed, and Marc if there's anything additional they want to contribute, and then I'll open it to the floor for any last-minute comments. From Alan, thank you for your presentation, and also linking up to what Louise had mentioned from the first session, the first breakout group as well. I mean, we're really looking at a whole kind of multi-dimensional aspect to the crises, and you outlined as spatial aspects, infrastructure and services, institutional, economic, social and security. And then from what Louise had just contributed as well, I think that, what we're looking at is, a new potential to collaborate, which, comes from understanding of how both of the systems work and what can be done to better connect. Is there any kind of final comment from your side in terms of your thematic approach and what you presented, Ellen?
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, because this was a little bit the discussion in our group too, or it was sort of the direction, one of the directions the discussion was going on, and it surfaced in various different places. But this question of how to not just coordinate on what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, but actually on how you're going to pay for it. And I know there was some discussion about like, oh, there should be basically one big pot of money and everybody should pay, that's my experience is great on paper, never works. But what I have seen work is where people have agreed with the government where they're trying to go, how they're going to get there, and then among themselves where their comparative advantage is. And they have taken pieces of, in essence, a broader program and said, okay, we're going to do, and this happened, I think, in Haiti after the earthquake, but, we're going to do yellow houses and fixing them up. And we're going to provide new houses for people who've lost houses. And we're going to run the camps for the people who are living in the camps. So all of those different things, just to say, I think people have different funding windows. They have different ways of raising money. They have different mandates, et cetera. And in my own sort of experience, the easiest way to actually do something together is to not make it too formally together.
Sure. And maybe this picks up on the final point that Richard just made around joint training and understanding, because there are these deeper layers to these processes that need some knowledge building and capacity building aspects, which is something that we've discussed amongst ourselves more than once. So no, thanks, Alan. Thank you very much. I'll just quickly go over to Dyfed as well now and wrap up the second breakout group. I mean, Dyfed, I noted that one of the issues that you really highlighted at the end, and then also that came out from the second group, was around partnerships in urban areas and partnering with urban authorities and urban communities in a different kind of way. Of course, that's easier in a context of non-destruction in an urban area. You're speaking really more of the rural-urban migration continuum, and looking at displacement from that perspective. I think that you also really highlighted the lack of policy discussions and the fact that there is little political incentivization, because if the urban authorities aren't receiving the funds, it really is just more stick than carrot. How do we get past that impasse? So maybe a thought from your side on that to wrap up any points that you have, and including the second breakout group. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I think incentivizing cities to, the typical response is like, let it be your problem, don't let it be my problem. And that incentive is very important. Incentivizing is very important. One thing we touched on is, having real serious proper engagement with urban actors in the local coordination structure. But also, if we really want them to be part of the process, we probably also need to channel funding into, take them seriously as service providers, understand their restrictions, of course, and guide them as needed. But start taking them seriously as part of the as part of the operation and as an important actor. And that means actually not just having their views, but actually empowering them to be part of that response. But I really also liked what Richard was saying. We probably know what we need to do. We just need to kind of get on with it as well. And I think as we model good practice, then other institutions, donors, and the rest of it would come along with it. So I think we need to we know what we need to do. We need to overcome our own institutional challenges and get on with it. So thank you.
Thanks, Dyfed. Much appreciated. We've only got a moment left. Marc, if I can hand over to you just for 1 minute of reflection, please. From your presentation and really from the outcome of the third breakout group, I mean, you're really talking about a longer period of engagement, 10 years of commitment in certain contexts, and really looking beyond the bubble of the rubble. And I really love that phrase. It's very telling, and I think it's a good metaphor for reframing how some of the humanitarian response should be rethought. So picking up on that idea, and then also what Richard mentioned in his wrap up of group 3, if you've just got 30 seconds or a minute or so just for a final thought or any concluding remark. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. I mean, nothing major, but just to come back to what I think is often the biggest reason why we don't know what we should be doing. We know that we should be doing it, but we don't do it. And why is that? Why? And for me, I think it's just because people don't have enough time. I mean, when you have an immediate output that the deadline is a month from now, and you have some of these longer term assessments, that's always going to sort of take second if you're expecting the same person to do that. So for me, I think it really is about different organizations staffing for each of those functions separately and in parallel from the beginning, so that someone has the mandate to think long from the first day. If you try to expect the same person to do it, it's just never going to happen because of the immediate priorities. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marc. Much appreciated. So I'd like to really welcome, thank you to all the panelists, and welcome some forward thinking from all the participants as well going on into the future. Ella, I don't know if you can hear us okay, but if you'd like to provide any concluding remarks, if you're available. Thanks, Ella. Much appreciated.
Yes, I'm here. I'm not so sure if everyone can hear me, but
we can.
Yes, good. Thanks so much. I'm here, and it's been a pleasure to listen to the conversations at this session, because it's one of our priority areas, and it's really something that we would like to at the Global Shelter Cluster. Maybe we're not going to be the answer to everything, but we really would like to lead and facilitate this dialogue and be part of the solution, actually, for connecting better. I've heard some very interesting points. It was also quite encouraging to also hear some contributions from our speakers that I think that we're already making some progress on. So it shows that we're on the right track. I think today I have just read in the Global Humanitarian Overview that came out that it's expected that twice as many people will require humanitarian assistance this year compared to just 5 years ago. So the challenge is huge, but I think some gains have been made by recent crises like COVID, but also the Beirut blast that actually shows us how important it is to work in cities. I think it has been mentioned quite a few times in this session that working in cities pushes us to think differently. So we have to move to the Nexus thinking. It also pushes us to work with different groups, and that has also been evidence, I think, in the COVID response. All of a sudden today in my team meeting, we were discussing how we could be engaging in conversations around social protection to link cash and voucher assistance that we do in humanitarian work, and also how we can maybe work with homeless populations. That also links in with some of our work around rental and all that. So I think a lot is happening. There's a lot of change. I also specifically liked the point that Dyfed had made from moving from a service provider to the liaising one. It was actually even in my notes, so I didn't steal it from you. It just means that we were thinking along the same lines. And of course, localization, in the sense that we don't have to localize, we just have to engage really good local capacity. I think that's the key. I've been throughout the day with colleagues that I've known for a long time who have been working in their countries for a long time, and the reason for that is that they're qualified people who stay in their countries to do the good work. Most of us have already left those countries, so it's also evidence in our audience today, and it's very encouraging that high quality and high capacity people can add a great deal to our thinking. And of course, trusting and investing in systems and governments is also something that I take away. It still means that we need to remain agile and be able to move across the slide, because there are some humanitarian crises at this moment that are going on that really still forces us to work in the way that we've been doing for a long time, but it doesn't mean that we cannot become more agile and work on transferable skills also for ourselves and for our partners. So I think these are the points that I will be taking away. I'm also happy to say that this is a high priority issue for our donor consultation group as well, that we're really trying to look forward together. And I thank you very much for being part of the thinking and the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ella, and thanks for that really complete summary, really helpful. A warm thank you again to all the panelists, the three panelists that we've just had, to Ellen, Dyfed and Marc. Really great contributions and sowing the seeds of the discussion, and also very much to our breakout group facilitators, Louise, Tulio and Richard, much appreciated. And thanks everyone for participating. It's been a really wonderful discussion. We've got a lot to follow up on. We've got our urban settlements working group to bring forward some of the discussion, but also raise up these issues as well. A final note from my side, just as a reminder to everybody for the sessions tomorrow, we've got the second of our thematic sessions on shelter and health, beginning at noon Geneva time. And so that'll be a great session. There's a lot of preparation involved in that one with some really interesting discussions. The second session tomorrow is from 2 to 3:30 p.m, which is the update from the working groups and communities of practice. So a follow on from today's session. And then we have a networking session from 4 to 5 p.m. For all the colleagues based in Africa or working in Africa or interested in collaborating. So thank you very much, and good afternoon, early evening, morning to everybody, and thanks again for participating. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Talk soon.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Bye.
Thanks a lot.